Have you ever tried to sit in complete silence and noticed how impossibly loud your mind becomes? Even when the room is quiet, even when no one is around, there's a storm inside us, a restless, invisible storm. Thoughts rise and fall like waves in a violent sea. Worries about tomorrow, regrets from yesterday, anxieties you can't quite name, desires you didn't even know you had. It never stops. And if you pay attention, you'll realize most of us don't live in the world as it is, but in the world our minds endlessly fabricate. A friend smiles at you and you wonder if they mean it. A stranger's words linger in your head for days. You replay an awkward moment from 5 years ago as if it just happened. It's like we're carrying a radio inside our heads and it never, ever turns off. But why is it like this? Why can't our minds be still, even for a moment? Why is peace something we have to chase instead of something we naturally feel? In ancient Buddhist teachings, they compare the human mind to a body of water. When water is calm and undisturbed, it reflects everything clearly: the sky, the moon, the stars. But when the wind stirs, when stones are thrown in, when ripples cross each other, the reflection shatters. And so it is with our minds. When we're agitated, afraid, consumed by endless wants and fears, we no longer see the world for what it is. We see a distorted version, a world colored by our own unsettled thoughts. A Zen master once said, "The way is not difficult if you have no preferences." But how can you have no preferences when every moment of modern life seems designed to pull you one way or another? Notifications flashing, deadlines looming, opinions clashing. You scroll through a feed and feel envy. You hear a news story and feel rage. You remember a past mistake and feel shame. The storm inside brews stronger. And yet, somewhere deep within us, there's a part untouched by all this noise. A stillness that's been waiting patiently, like a clear pond beneath layers of disturbed water. The problem is, we've spent so long living on the surface that we've forgotten how to sink back down to it. If you look closely, you'll see how even the simplest experiences become distorted through the lens of a restless mind. Take, for example, walking through a park. The trees are there. The air is cool. The sky is vast. But are you really there? Or are you thinking about a meeting later, worrying about a text that hasn't come, or imagining 100 different futures that may never arrive? We lose our lives in thoughts, not in living. The Buddha once described this as being carried away by the river of delusion. Most people don't even realize they're drowning because the current feels so familiar. We mistake activity for life. We confuse distraction with entertainment. We call the storm normal, and we forget that there was ever such a thing as stillness. But imagine, just for a moment, what would it feel like if the storm inside you calmed? If the endless commentary fell silent? If instead of chasing after every thought like a dog chasing cars, you could let them pass, untouched, like clouds drifting across a clear sky? What might you see then? What might you understand about yourself, about others, about this strange, beautiful, tragic, astonishing world? The ancient sages believed that wisdom isn't something you acquire. It's something you uncover. Because underneath all the noise, all the craving, all the fear, there's a quiet clarity already within you. The question is, how do we find it again? How do we return to that original, undisturbed mind, like still water reflecting the sky? This journey isn't about renouncing the world, shaving your head, or disappearing into a mountaintop monastery. It's about discovering how to live within the chaos without letting the chaos live within you. Because the world will never be silent. People will still lie. Hearts will still break. Plans will still fail. But if you can learn to steady the water of your own mind, you'll see things as they are, and in that seeing there's peace. And so, as we begin this quiet exploration together, remember, You don't need to fix the world. You don't need to control everything. You only need to calm the storm inside. Because when the water is still, everything reflects. And perhaps, in that reflection, you'll recognize the face you've been searching for all along. Long before science could measure brain waves, long before modern psychology could name anxiety or overthinking, ancient sages already understood the restless nature of the human mind. They saw it in the way people clung to what they desired and fled from what they feared. They saw it in how one small thought could ripple out, disturbing an entire lifetime. And to explain this, they gave us a metaphor, a simple, timeless image that carries the weight of centuries. The mind is like water. When water is calm, it mirrors the sky, the moon, the trees, the stars. Every detail appears sharp, undistorted. But the moment the wind stirs, the surface trembles, the reflections fracture. And what you see is no longer what truly is, but a blurred, shifting image of your own disturbance. In Buddhist philosophy, this isn't just poetry. It's a map to understanding your inner world. They teach that our suffering, our restlessness, frustration, and sorrow doesn't come from the world itself. It comes from how our minds react to the world, like water rippling at every disturbance. A harsh word from a stranger, an unexpected failure, a desire unmet, a memory we can't let go of. Each of these strikes the surface of our consciousness like a stone thrown into a pond. And what do? We chase the ripples. We dive after the stone. We fight against the very waves we ourselves have created. But here's the thing no one tells you. The water was never meant to stay disturbed. If you leave it alone, truly leave it alone, it settles on its own. Not by force, not by control, but by the quiet, natural law of things. Buddhist texts like the Dhammapada remind us, the mind is difficult to control, swift and light, flitting wherever it pleases. It is good to tame the mind, for a well-tamed mind brings happiness. Notice it doesn't say fight the mind or suppress it. It says to tame it, like a wild horse, not through violence but through understanding, patience, and skill. And the metaphor of still water teaches us how. When you look into turbulent water, you can't see your own reflection. You can't see reality. You see only movement, distortion, confusion. And yet, underneath all those restless waves, the essence of the water remains unchanged. It's not dirty. It's not broken. It's not bad. It's simply stirred. And this is how the great Buddhist teachers viewed the mind. At your core, you are not flawed, anxious, or restless. Those are passing ripples on the surface. Your true nature, what Zen calls your original face before your parents were born, is still clear and vast. The tragedy is, most people live their entire lives reacting to the waves without ever diving deep enough to remember the stillness beneath. This is why meditation became central in Buddhist practice. It's not about sitting cross-legged and emptying the mind by force. It's about watching the ripples without chasing them, letting the stones sink without diving after them. Over time, the water settles, the reflections sharpen, and you begin to see. You see that desires are clouds passing, that fears are winds temporary, that thoughts rise and fall like waves never lasting. And the deeper you go, the less those surface ripples matter. The Buddha himself compared enlightenment to a vast, still lake. When no wind blows, when no stones disturb, it perfectly reflects the world above. And in that perfect reflection, one realizes there is no self, no other, no division between the sky and the water, between the reflection and the thing reflected. There is just what is. Of course, in modern life, this teaching feels distant. Who has time to sit by a quiet pond when there are emails, deadlines, heartbreaks, and bills? But the metaphor isn't asking you to escape the world. It's asking you to find stillness within it. Because the truth is, life will always throw stones into your pond. You can't stop it, but you can learn to let the ripples pass. You don't need to chase every thought. You don't need to fix every emotion. You only need to notice. And in noticing, the water begins to still. The metaphor of still water is an ancient superstition. It's a guide to reclaiming your own mind in a noisy, chaotic, demanding world. And here's the quiet secret hidden in plain sight. When you steady your own water, the world around you begins to change. Not because the world is different, but because your reflection of it is no longer shattered by your own disturbance. You see people's anger as their own ripples, not as threats. You see your own fear as a passing wave, not a permanent truth. You begin to live not in reaction but in awareness, and in that awareness peace arises. Not a forced, stiff peace, but a deep, quiet, unshakable calm like a pond at dawn before the first wind. This is what the old masters pointed to when they spoke of liberation. Not an escape, not a life free of hardship, but a life where your mind, like still water, can reflect even the darkest night sky without fear. Because the water never fears the storm, it only waits for it to pass, and so do you. Have you ever noticed how a single thought can hijack your entire day? You wake up feeling fine. The sun filters through your window. The air smells clean. And then, one small thought appears. I forgot to reply to that message. What if I messed up that meeting yesterday? Why did they look at me like that? And suddenly, you're not in your room anymore. You're inside your head, chasing 100 outcomes, building stories from shadows, playing scenes that may never happen. Your body sits still, but your mind is a storm. In Buddhist philosophy, this is called the monkey mind. A restless, anxious, unpredictable thing, leaping from branch to branch, never pausing, always craving the next distraction, the next reassurance, the next escape. And here's the catch, it's not your fault. It's the nature of the untrained mind. For thousands of years, Buddhist teachers have explained that the mind's default state is restlessness. Why? Because it's constantly pulled by two forces: desire and aversion. We chase what we want. We run from what we fear. And between those two poles, our thoughts swing like a pendulum, never at rest. You want approval. You fear rejection. You crave pleasure. You avoid pain. And every thought, every emotion, every reaction is like a thread woven into that endless loop. The tragedy is most of us believe every thought we have. We mistake thoughts for truth. We mistake emotions for commands. But here's a truth most people never hear. A thought is just a thought. An emotion is just a temporary wave in your body. Neither is permanent. Neither defines you. Neither requires obedience. Buddhist philosophy teaches that our suffering begins when we become attached to these passing experiences. When we cling to pleasure, when we fight against discomfort, when we identify with every story our restless mind creates. It's not the thoughts themselves that cause suffering, it's our relationship to them. A thought arises, I'm not good enough. And instead of letting it pass, we hold it, we repeat it, we build a case around it, and soon it becomes a belief. An emotion surges, anxiety, jealousy, anger. And instead of watching it rise and fall, we dive in. We swim in it. We let it pull us under. But here's what the old masters knew: the nature of the mind is to produce thoughts, just as the heart pumps blood. You can no more stop your thoughts than you can stop your heartbeat. And you don't need to. The goal isn't to eliminate thinking. It's to change your relationship to it. Like watching clouds drift across the sky, knowing you are the sky, vast, open, untouched, and not the passing clouds. Or as Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said, leave your front door and your back door open. Allow your thoughts to come and go. Just don't serve them tea. Let them visit, but don't entertain them. This shift from identifying with the mind to observing it is the foundation of Buddhist mindfulness practice. Because when you step back, when you notice your own thoughts without judgment, something remarkable happens. You realize, the mind worries, but you are not worry. The mind fears, but you are not fear. The mind remembers, but you are not the past. You are the awareness in which these thoughts arise and dissolve. And here's the secret. When you stop fighting your mind's restlessness, when you stop chasing every thought or running from every emotion, the mind begins to settle. Not because you forced it, but because you're no longer fueling the storm. The waves subside when the wind stops, and the wind stops when you no longer chase the waves. In Buddhist terms, this is called vipassana, insight meditation, not suppressing thoughts, not escaping emotions, but seeing them clearly as they are, temporary, impersonal, passing. The restless mind becomes a teacher. Each thought shows you your attachments. Each emotion reveals what you cling to, and in that awareness you begin to untie the knots of suffering. Not by fixing the mind, not by silencing it, but by understanding its nature. The Buddha once told his followers, a person is not called wise because they talk a lot. But if they are peaceful, loving, and fearless, then they are truly called wise. And peace doesn't come when you have no thoughts. It comes when you no longer fear them, when you can let them come and go like waves upon the shore. And remember this, no storm lasts forever. No thought is permanent. No emotion defines you. You are the vast, quiet space in which all these rise and fall. And in that space, freedom begins. Have you ever tried to look into a muddy pond? No matter how hard you squint, the reflection is distorted. The water ripples, the surface trembles, and you can't see what lies beneath. Now imagine that pond is your mind. When your thoughts are racing, your emotions boiling, your worries stacking one upon another, what do you see of the world? Only your own disturbance mirrored back at you. This is one of the oldest teachings in Buddhism. A restless mind distorts reality. A calm mind reflects it clearly. Let's pause for a moment and consider this. Most of us think we see the world as it is. We believe our perceptions are objective, reliable, even fair. But the truth is, we rarely experience reality directly. We experience it through the filter of our mental state. When you're anxious, neutral faces look suspicious. When you're angry, small inconveniences feel like attacks. When you're afraid, the future seems threatening. And when you're at peace, life feels kinder, the same life you feared yesterday. In Buddhism, this is called the mind-made world. We don't suffer because of the world itself. We suffer because of the way our mind interprets it. A Zen master once said, "The world is neither good nor bad. Thinking makes it so." Think about it, the same rainy day that frustrates one person may soothe another. The same silence that unnerves some brings comfort to others. It's not the rain, it's not the silence, it's the mind reacting to them. And here's the wisdom the ancient teachers uncovered. When the mind is calm, it stops projecting. It stops labeling everything as good or bad, mine or not mine, threat or desire. A calm mind begins to see things as they are, simple, fleeting, interconnected. The sound of the wind in the trees, the coolness of air on your skin, the soft ache in your chest, each arising, each passing without resistance. And in that state, clarity arrives. This is why meditators throughout history speak of moments when the world seems sharper, more vivid, yet strangely weightless. Not because reality has changed, but because the turbulence in the mind has settled, like a still pond reflecting the moon perfectly, undistorted. Modern neuroscience now echoes what Buddhism taught centuries ago. Studies show that when the mind is agitated, stress hormones rise, perception narrows, and our brains exaggerate threats while overlooking beauty and nuance. We literally stop seeing what's in front of us. But when calm, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for clarity, compassion, and wise decision-making, comes online. The world doesn't change, we do. And here's a simple truth: a calm mind isn't naive. It doesn't deny hardship. It simply sees hardship as part of the passing scenery of life, not as a permanent state, not as a personal punishment. It sees joy the same way. It neither clings to pleasure nor fights against pain. It moves with life, like a river flowing effortlessly around rocks. And perhaps that's what makes peace so elusive for many. We chase peace by trying to control the outside world. We want quiet surroundings, agreeable people, predictable outcomes. But the Buddha taught, peace comes not from controlling the storm, but from learning to sit calmly within it. A calm mind in this sense isn't passive, it's powerful, because it no longer wastes energy resisting what cannot be changed. It no longer projects old fears onto new moments. It sees things as they are, not as we wish or fear them to be. And in that seeing, suffering softens. The anxious thought arises, what if I fail? And you notice it, watch it, and it passes. The old anger flares, they wronged me. And you observe it, let it burn out. Nothing needs fixing, nothing needs chasing. Because the truth is, reality itself is neither enemy nor savior. It simply is. And when the mind becomes calm enough to reflect that, we finally meet life, not as we imagine it, but as it quietly, beautifully is. If a restless mind distorts the world, and a calm mind reflects it clearly, then the question becomes, how do we calm the mind? For thousands of years, spiritual seekers, philosophers, and ordinary people burdened by life's chaos have turned to a single, timeless practice: meditation. But let's be honest, the word meditation has been tossed around so much these days, it's almost lost its meaning. We picture monks in robes, sitting cross-legged in mountain caves, or some wellness influencer on Instagram sipping herbal tea beside a candle. But the truth is, meditation was never meant to be an aesthetic. It's a tool, a fierce, practical, life-changing tool. And its power lies not in escaping the world, but in transforming how we meet it. At its heart, meditation is simply the art of observing, noticing your breath, noticing your thoughts, noticing your emotions as they arise without clinging, without resisting. It sounds simple, and it is, but simplicity doesn't mean easy. The mind, like a wild animal, resists being tamed. It kicks, it bites. It latches onto every passing thought. What should I have for dinner? Why did they say that to me? What if I never figure my life out? And yet, moment by moment, breath by breath, meditation teaches us to return, to witness the storm without being swept away by it. Buddhism teaches that the mind creates suffering by clinging and resisting. We chase what we want. We fight what we fear. And in doing so, we exhaust ourselves. But when you sit in stillness, watching the endless river of thoughts flow by, something remarkable happens. You begin to realize, you are not your thoughts. You are the awareness behind them. The worry arises. What if I fail? And you notice it. The anger stirs. They betrayed me. And you notice it. The desire whispers. If only I had this, then I'd be happy. And you notice it. And each time you notice, rather than react, a little space opens up. And in that space, peace lives. Modern science is now catching up to what ancient monks intuited centuries ago. Brain scans show that regular meditation reduces activity in the brain's fear center, the amygdala, and strengthens areas responsible for focus, empathy, and emotional regulation. People who meditate regularly report lower stress, better sleep, improved concentration, and a deeper sense of meaning in life. Not because their external world is less chaotic, but because their relationship to it has changed. And then there's mindfulness. If meditation is the training ground, mindfulness is the application. It's what you carry with you when you leave the cushion or the quiet room. It's how you walk through a noisy city street, a difficult conversation, a moment of grief, fully present. Mindfulness is nothing mystical. It's the practice of being exactly where you are, doing exactly what you're doing, washing dishes, driving home, listening to a friend, feeling the rise and fall of your breath when anxiety grips your chest. It's remembering to be here, not lost in what was, not anxious about what will be, and in these small, humble moments of presence we reclaim our lives, one breath, one footstep, one conscious choice at a time. Because peace was never waiting at the end of some distant road. It was always here, buried beneath the noise. The old Zen saying goes, you should sit in meditation for 20 minutes a day unless you're too busy. Then you should sit for an hour. It sounds like a joke, but it's a profound truth. The busier we are, the more scattered, restless, and reactive our minds become, and the more essential it is to return to stillness. Even 5 minutes of mindful breathing can soften the edges of a hard day. A quiet moment of observation before reacting can spare us from needless conflict. And over time, these small, repeated acts of awareness reshape the mind itself. The storm quiets, the pond clears, and what once felt unbearable begins to lose its weight, not because life got easier, but because you got clearer. And perhaps that's the real power of meditation and mindfulness, not to escape suffering, but to meet it fully, and in doing so, transform it. There's a famous Zen story. A monk asked his master, "How can I remain undisturbed when the world is on fire?" The master replied, "Become the water. The world is noisy, unpredictable. It throws storms, betrayals, traffic jams, broken hearts, pandemics, and bills we didn't expect. It delivers joy one moment, then grief the next. And the truth is, we have no control over any of it. We think we do. We cling to plans, identities, outcomes, and promises. But as the Buddha said over 2,500 years ago, everything that has a beginning has an end. Nothing is permanent. And yet we fight this truth every day. We resist when people change. We grieve when things slip through our fingers. We panic when life refuses to follow our carefully drawn maps. The source of so much of our suffering isn't the world itself, but our attachment to how we wish it would be. Here's the paradox. We can't stop the waves, but we can learn to surf. And that's what living without being disturbed truly means. It doesn't mean isolating yourself in a monastery or pretending life's difficulties don't exist. It means meeting each moment fully, without clinging, without resisting, without losing yourself in it. When someone insults you, it stings. When a plan falls apart, it hurts. When uncertainty comes, the mind panics. But the difference lies in this. Do you react blindly or respond mindfully? The masterful practitioner doesn't become numb. They become aware. They feel the sting, acknowledge the anger, witness the fear, and then release it. Like clouds passing through an open sky, they understand that emotions are visitors. They come, they stay a while, and then they leave. Your job isn't to invite them to stay forever, nor to slam the door in their face. It's to offer them a cup of tea and then kindly let them go. The old sages knew this. They taught that life's disturbances are like echoes in a cave. If you stop shouting back, the echoes eventually fade. And so, when the world throws its noise at you, a rude stranger, a cruel comment online, a moment of loneliness, a wave of self-doubt, pause, breathe, witness. And instead of reacting, allow the moment to pass through you like wind through an open window. This doesn't mean you become passive. It means you choose your response instead of being owned by it. You set boundaries when needed. You speak truth when it matters, but you no longer fight reality. You flow with it. As one Zen master put it, "When walking, walk, when eating, eat." Simple words, but beneath them lies a profound wisdom. To be fully where you are, doing what you're doing, without dragging the baggage of past regrets or future anxieties into this moment. Because the truth is, nothing outside of you has the power to disturb your peace unless you give it permission. The traffic doesn't disturb you, your resistance to it does. The delay isn't suffering, your impatience makes it so. The loss hurts, but clinging turns it into a lifelong wound. And when you begin to see this, really see it, a quiet freedom is born. A freedom not from difficulty, but from unnecessary suffering. You become like the mountain in the storm. The winds howl, the rains fall, but the mountain remains unmoved. Your heart feels, your eyes weep, your hands tremble, and yet beneath it all there's a space untouched. A space where peace lives, not because life is perfect, but because you've stopped demanding that it be. And in that space you begin to live truly. You laugh freely, knowing joy is fleeting. You love deeply, knowing everything you hold will someday be let go. You act wisely, not because life owes you certainty, but because your clarity no longer depends on it. And perhaps in the quiet of those moments, you realize the greatest victory is controlling the world. It's mastering yourself. There's a language older than words, a way of knowing that doesn't require explanation. The Zen masters spoke it fluently without speaking at all. Their teachings weren't meant to be dissected like theories in a book. They were meant to be lived, felt, realized in the marrow of your bones. And perhaps this is why, for centuries, Zen monks would answer the deepest of life's questions not with lectures, but with silence, or a single, unexpected gesture, a raised finger, a sudden shout, the sound of a stone dropping into still water, because they understood something the modern mind often forgets. Words are fingers pointing to the moon. But to truly see the moon, you must stop staring at the finger. And so they taught in riddles, in paradoxes, in quiet moments beside a bamboo grove, not to confuse their students, but to shatter the prison of concepts. One famous story tells of a student who asked his master, "What is Zen?" The master didn't answer. Instead, he simply held up a flower. The student gazed at it, and in that instant, beyond words, beyond thought, he understood. This is the heart of Zen. It isn't about accumulating knowledge. It's about letting go of what you think you know until all that remains is direct, wordless experience. When you taste a ripe peach, no description is necessary. When you watch a sunset bleed into the ocean, no poem can capture its truth. And when you sit in stillness, feeling your breath rise and fall, without chasing or resisting a single thought, that is Zen, a stillness not of the body alone, but of the mind. A quiet that holds everything, the sound of a crow's cry, the ache in your chest, the warmth of sunlight on your face. The Zen masters knew that life itself is the greatest scripture. Every rustling leaf, every drop of rain, every heartbeat. And the greatest wisdom isn't buried in sacred texts, but in your direct, unfiltered encounter with this present moment. That's why one master would strike his students with a stick if they started explaining too much. Not out of cruelty, but to wake them up, to jolt them out of their fog of analysis and into the raw clarity of now. As the old saying goes, when hungry, eat, when tired, sleep. Simple yet profound. Because how often do we truly do that? When eating, we scroll through our phones. When walking, our minds wander to past regrets and future worries. We live everywhere but here. The Zen masters invite us back. Not with sermons, but with presence. They remind us, this moment is enough, you are already home. And it's in this realization that the storm of the restless mind begins to settle. Not because you've solved every problem. Not because life has finally become easy, but because you've stopped insisting that it be anything other than what it is. You return to the simplicity of breath, the sound of wind in the trees, the warmth of tea in your hands, and you discover a peace not found in achieving, possessing, or controlling, but in being. As one Zen poet wrote, "Sitting quietly doing nothing, spring comes and the grass grows by itself. No striving, no forcing, just life unfolding." And in that stillness beyond words, you realize something extraordinary. The clarity you've been chasing was here all along, waiting patiently in the silence you kept overlooking. Somewhere within you, beneath the constant chatter, beneath the doubts and desires, beneath the long-forgotten memories and imagined futures, there's a place untouched by noise, a quiet sanctuary, a still lake undisturbed by the winds of the world. But how do we reach it? Is it reserved for monks in remote monasteries, or wise sages who have renounced the world? The answer is simpler than you think. And it begins with understanding one crucial truth. Your restless mind isn't your enemy. It's simply a reflection of your conditioning. For years, perhaps decades, you've been trained to chase, to compare, to label every experience as good or bad, desirable or dreadful. And like a glass of muddy water constantly stirred, your mind has rarely known stillness. But what happens when you stop stirring? When you stop grasping, stop resisting, and simply allow yourself to be as you are? Slowly, the mud begins to settle, and beneath it, the clarity reveals itself. The ancient masters taught that the path to a calm mind isn't about forcing your thoughts to disappear. It's about no longer being enslaved by them. Like clouds drifting across a vast sky, your thoughts come and go, but the sky remains untouched. And so the journey begins. First, through awareness. Notice the racing thoughts, the sudden anger, the craving, not to judge them, but to see them. In that seeing, there's space. And in that space, freedom. Every moment of awareness is a small act of liberation, a tiny crack in the fortress of habitual reactivity. Then comes acceptance. Understand this. A calm mind isn't a mind without thoughts. It's a mind that no longer clings to them. When sadness arises, let it arise. When joy arrives, let it arrive. Both are passing guests in the house of your awareness. You don't need to entertain them. You don't need to banish them. Simply watch. As Zen master Shunryu Suzuki said, leave your front door and your back door open. Let thoughts come and go. Just don't serve them tea. The more you practice this, the more natural it becomes. And gradually, without even realizing it, you begin to spend more time in the quiet spaces between thoughts, the gaps, the silences. The moments where, for no particular reason, you feel at ease, not because life is perfect, but because you're no longer demanding that it be. And here lies another secret: simplicity. Modern life thrives on complexity, more choices, more noise, more distractions, but peace often hides in the simplest acts. The feel of sunlight on your face, the rhythm of your breathing, the weight of a cup in your hands. These aren't trivial moments, they're the gateways. Every great tradition, from Zen to Stoicism, from early Buddhist teachings to the wisdom of indigenous elders, reminds us, peace isn't found in escape, it's discovered in presence. And the final step on this path is trust. Trust that you don't need to control every moment to be okay, that even in uncertainty you can rest, that even amidst chaos, you can find your center, because the calm you seek is not out there. It's not in a future moment when everything aligns. It's right here, in the pause between this breath and the next. It's in the way your chest rises and falls, in the sound of distant traffic, in the warmth of your own skin. And the more you return to these quiet, ordinary miracles, the more you realize stillness was never missing. You were simply looking elsewhere. So the path to a calm mind isn't a destination. It's a homecoming, a gentle return. to what was always waiting. And if you close your eyes even now for a single moment, you might just catch a glimpse of it. The silent witness, the unshaken center, the deep, untroubled peace that is and has always been you. Imagine for a moment what your life would feel like if the storms within you finally quieted. What if, when people insulted you, you no longer flinched? What if, when uncertainty knocked on your door, you greeted it with a calm heart? What if, instead of chasing peace in the outside world, you carried it with you everywhere you went? This isn't a distant fantasy. It's a natural result of inner stillness. When your mind becomes calm, like a perfectly still lake, it begins to reflect everything clearly. You see life, not as you wish it to be, but as it truly is. And in that clarity, something miraculous happens. Suffering loses its grip on you. Pain still exists, yes, but it no longer owns you. Like watching clouds drift across the sky, you witness anger, grief, or fear arise and pass away. You begin to realize that you are not your emotions. You are the vast awareness in which they appear and disappear. And here's the thing no one tells you. This changes everything. When you're no longer enslaved by every passing thought or feeling, you gain access to something most people only taste in rare moments: genuine freedom. A freedom not dependent on wealth or status or perfect circumstances. A freedom born from within. And with that freedom comes effortless compassion. When your own inner noise subsides, you can finally hear others, truly hear them. Not through the filter of your opinions, not with the reflex to judge or compare, but with presence. You begin to sense the silent suffering in strangers. You see the fragile beauty in even the most difficult people. Why? Because without the storm of your own mind distracting you, you're able to notice what was always there, the shared humanity in every face you meet. Stillness makes you kind, not out of duty, not because a book told you to, but because kindness becomes your natural state when you're no longer busy protecting your ego. And it does more. It sharpens your intuition. You make better decisions not from fear, not from compulsion, but from clarity. Your actions become skillful, timely, and appropriate because you're no longer reacting. You're responding. There's a profound difference. And relationships, they transform too. When you stop clinging to control, stop demanding that people behave a certain way to satisfy your expectations. Suddenly, you begin to love them for who they are, not for what they can give you. You listen more, you argue less. You stop chasing validation. And in doing so, you discover the simple joy of being connected, heart to heart, with no agenda. Inner stillness also strengthens your resilience. Life, of course, will still deliver its storms. Illness, loss, injustice, they don't disappear, but your relationship to them changes. Instead of being tossed by every wave, you become the ocean. The winds may howl, but your depths remain undisturbed. You meet adversity with grace. You carry grief without drowning in it. You savor joy without clinging to it. This is the unshakable peace spoken of by sages throughout time. The Buddha called it nirvana, not as a place, but as a state of being unbound. The Zen masters called it original mind, the clarity you had before the world told you who to be. And modern psychology, after centuries of catching up, now calls it flow, presence, equanimity. Names change, but the experience is timeless. And perhaps the most beautiful benefit of all is that stillness makes life feel sacred again. The small things, a child's laugh, the texture of rain on your skin, the scent of wood smoke at dusk, become immense, not because they changed, but because your mind finally stopped long enough to notice. You return to wonder. And in that state, you realize you don't need to possess life. You only need to experience it, fully, consciously, with an open heart. And so, the infinite benefits of inner stillness aren't about becoming someone new. They're about remembering the person you were before the noise, before the striving, before the labels, before the fear. And in that remembering, you come home to yourself, to this moment, to peace. And now we arrive at the quiet shore of our journey. Perhaps you didn't notice it at first, but something in you has already begun to settle, like dust in a sunbeam, slowly descending to the earth. There's a strange, gentle magic that happens when we remember the stillness we've always carried within. A part of you knows this place. It's not foreign, it's home. The Zen masters often spoke of the mind as a mirror. When it's clouded by thoughts, desires, and fears, it distorts everything it reflects. But when the surface grows still, when the ripples cease, it reveals the truth of the world and the truth of yourself. In that reflection, you realize something simple yet profoundly freeing. There was never anything wrong with you. You were never broken, never lacking. You were simply distracted by the noise of a restless mind. And now, in these moments of quiet, you can begin to see clearly. The beauty of a leaf trembling in the breeze, the unrepeatable tenderness of a loved one's smile, the infinite vastness contained in your own breath. You discover that life was never meant to be conquered. It was meant to be witnessed. And in that witnessing, a deep, enduring peace arises. Not because life becomes easier, but because you've stopped resisting what is. Stillness is not an escape. It's not a hiding place from the troubles of the world. It's the ground from which true, compassionate action arises. A calm mind is not indifferent. It feels everything more deeply, but it is no longer swept away. It holds joy without clinging. It holds sorrow without drowning. And so as we close this exploration together, I leave you with a simple invitation. Return. Return to this place of still water whenever you need it. Not just in meditation, but in the ordinary moments waiting in traffic, washing a cup, listening to rain. The mirror is always there. You need only look. And if this journey stirred something within you, if a part of your heart whispered, "Yes, this is what I've been seeking," then I invite you to continue walking this path with us. Here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we create these spaces of quiet reflection and ancient teaching to remind each other of what matters. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, not as another thing to collect, but as a gentle hand to hold on your path. And when you're ready, return. We'll be here. The water is still, and it is waiting for you.